In the early years of the 1940s, the world felt as though it was slipping into something darker than war. Cities were already burning across Europe. Nations were collapsing under the boots of invading armies. And the future no longer looked like progress, but survival. Science, which had once promised humanity a better tomorrow, was now being washed with fear. Because for the first time in history, knowledge itself had become dangerous. In laboratories far away from the battlefield, equations were beginning to suggest that a single discovery could end entire cities in seconds. The world did not yet know the word atomic bomb, but the people who understood physics knew that something irreversible had been unlocked. The fear that drove the United States toward the atomic bomb did not originate in Washington or the Pentagon. It was born in Europe, in the minds of scientists who were running for their lives. When Adolf Hitler rose to power, Germany lost some of its greatest scientific thinkers almost overnight. Jewish physicists and intellectuals were forced out of universities, stripped of their positions, and hunted simply for who they were. Many escaped to Britain and the United States carrying more than just their belongings. They carried knowledge and a terrifying realization. Germany, even after driving out many of its scientists, still possessed enough expertise to build a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. In 1938, German scientists discovered nuclear fission, proving that the atom could be split and that enormous energy could be released in the process. To the average person, it meant nothing. To physicists, it meant everything. They understood that if this reaction could be controlled and accelerated, it could produce a blast more powerful than any conventional weapon ever created. Leo Szilard, one of the scientists who fled Nazi Germany, immediately grasped the danger. He understood that if Hitler obtained such a weapon first, the war would not just be lost, civilization itself could be threatened. Szilard and others tried to warn the American government, but their voices carried little weight until they reached one man whose name alone commanded respect across the world. Albert Einstein was not involved in building weapons, nor did he desire to be. Yet he understood the implications of what had been discovered. In August 1939, just weeks before Germany invaded Poland, Einstein signed a letter addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The letter warned that Nazi Germany might be developing a new and extremely powerful type of bomb and urged the United States to begin its own research immediately. Roosevelt read the letter carefully and recognized that this was not a matter for debate or delay. It was a matter of survival. From that moment, a quiet chain of decisions began, eventually forming what would later be known as the Manhattan Project. At first, it was small, uncertain, and experimental. But as the war intensified and intelligence reports grew darker, the project expanded rapidly. The United States committed enormous resources, not because it wanted such a weapon, but because it feared what would happen if it did not build one first. The bomb was not born from ambition alone. It was born from fear. Yet the greatest challenge was not money, materials, or even secrecy. The real challenge was leadership. The atomic bomb was not a single invention, but a massive collaboration across physics, chemistry, engineering, metallurgy, and mathematics. Thousands of scientists would be involved, many of them brilliant, stubborn, and unaccustomed to being told what to do. The military could manage construction and security, but it could not manage the minds required to turn theory into reality. The project needed a scientific leader who could understand every moving part and still keep the entire effort unified. That leader was not an obvious choice. In fact, many would later argue that he was the least obvious choice imaginable. Robert Oppenheimer was known as a gifted theoretical physicist, but he was not a Nobel Prize winner, nor was he famous for practical engineering. He had never managed a large laboratory, let alone a project of unprecedented scale. He was thin, intense, emotionally complex, and deeply introspective. He read poetry and ancient texts, spoke multiple languages, and often seemed lost in thought. More concerning to the government were his political associations. Oppenheimer had been connected to left-wing causes in the 1930s, including friends and family members who were involved with communist organizations. In an era of suspicion and wartime paranoia, this alone should have disqualified him. And yet, when the Army assigned General Leslie Groves to oversee the atomic bomb project, Groves saw something in Oppenheimer that others missed. During their meetings, Oppenheimer demonstrated a breathtaking understanding of the entire problem. He could explain the theoretical physics behind nuclear reactions, discuss the chemical challenges of refining materials, and anticipate engineering obstacles that had not yet appeared. He spoke rapidly, connecting ideas across disciplines in a way that suggested he could see the entire project as a single living system, rather than a collection of separate tasks. Groves later admitted that while Oppenheimer lacked traditional credentials, he possessed something far more valuable. He could make the impossible seem achievable. He could talk to Nobel Prize-winning scientists as equals, while also communicating effectively with military officers who had no patience for abstract theory. Most importantly, he understood the urgency. Oppenheimer knew that failure did not mean embarrassment or delay. It meant the possibility of losing the war, or worse, watching another nation unleash a weapon that could reshape the world forever. Oppenheimer was chosen not because he was flawless, but because he was uniquely suited to carry a burden that no one else wanted. He understood the science deeply enough to lead it, yet he was haunted by its consequences. Unlike some who viewed the bomb as a purely technical challenge, Oppenheimer saw it as a moral turning point for humanity. He knew that once such a weapon existed, the world would never return to what it was before. Knowledge could not be undone. When Oppenheimer selected Los Alamos, New Mexico, as the site for the bomb's development, it was not just for secrecy. The remote desert location reflected the isolation of the task itself. There, far from the public eye, a hidden city emerged almost overnight. Scientists, engineers, soldiers, and families lived behind fences, bound by secrecy and driven by urgency. Children rode bicycles, while their parents calculated explosive yields that could destroy entire cities. It was a strange, surreal existence, ordinary life unfolding alongside extraordinary danger. At the center of it all stood Oppenheimer. He worked relentlessly, moving from office to office, resolving disputes, clarifying theories, encouraging exhausted teams to keep going. He did not rule through authority alone, but through understanding. Scientists trusted him because he understood their work. The military trusted him because he delivered results. And yet, beneath his composed exterior, the weight of what he was creating never left him. Long before the first test explosion, Oppenheimer sensed that humanity was crossing a line. He continued not because he lacked doubt, but because doubt itself had become a luxury the world could not afford. In a time when Nazi Germany threatened to dominate the future, hesitation felt more dangerous than action. The bomb was moving from theory toward reality, and Oppenheimer was guiding it every step of the way, knowing that success would change the world and that failure might end it. This is where the story truly begins, not with an explosion, but with a man chosen to lead the most dangerous idea humanity had ever conceived, at a moment when the world believed it had no other choice. As Los Alamos grew from a quiet mesa into a secret city, the pressure surrounding the project became almost unbearable. Every person there understood that time was not neutral. Every passing week carried rumors, intelligence reports, and unanswered questions about Germany's progress. No one knew how close the enemy truly was, and that uncertainty fed an atmosphere where urgency bordered on desperation. The workdays stretched endlessly, nights blurred into mornings, and the isolation of the desert magnified every doubt and fear. Oppenheimer stood at the center of this storm, absorbing tension from every direction, fully aware that any failure would be measured not in careers ruined, but in lives lost. The scientific challenges soon proved far greater than early optimism had suggested. Building an atomic bomb was not a single problem, but 1,000 interconnected ones. Theoretical calculations did not always match experimental results, and small errors could invalidate months of work. The behavior of neutrons inside fissile material was unpredictable, and controlling a chain reaction required precision no one had ever achieved before. Scientists argued fiercely, sometimes angrily, over which design might actually work. Two competing approaches emerged, each with its own risks and uncertainties, and neither offered any guarantee of success. Oppenheimer's true talent revealed itself during these moments of conflict. Rather than forcing consensus, he listened. He allowed disagreement to surface, believing that honest argument was essential to discovering the truth. He moved between groups, translating one discipline's language into another's, ensuring that chemists understood physicists and engineers understood theorists. Many later recalled that Oppenheimer rarely told people what to think. Instead, he helped them see the problem clearly enough to decide for themselves. This ability to unify minds that naturally resisted authority was one of the reasons the project did not collapse under its own complexity. Yet beneath the surface, fear continued to grow. Early experiments failed more often than they succeeded, and certain designs appeared dangerously impractical. The original idea of using a simple gun-type mechanism to bring nuclear material together seemed promising, but only under specific conditions. When new data revealed that certain materials behaved unpredictably, entire plans had to be abandoned. This meant starting over, redesigning components, and risking delays that no one could afford. Each setback raised an unspoken question. What if the bomb could not be built in time? At the same moment, political pressure intensified. Military leaders demanded results, not explanations. They wanted certainty where none existed. General Groves supported Oppenheimer publicly, but even he worried privately about whether the physicist could deliver. Intelligence reports about Germany were vague and often contradictory, but they consistently hinted that German scientists were still active. Even the possibility that Hitler might acquire such a weapon first was enough to keep the project moving forward at full speed, regardless of doubt. Oppenheimer himself began to change under the strain. He slept less, ate poorly, and smoked constantly. Friends noticed that he grew thinner and more withdrawn, yet his focus sharpened. He carried the responsibility personally, as though the fate of the world rested on his ability to keep the project together. Unlike many around him, he did not view the bomb as an abstract solution to a military problem. He saw it as a turning point in human history, and that awareness weighed heavily on him. One of the most critical and least understood decisions of the project occurred during this period, when Oppenheimer supported a risky and unproven design that many feared would fail. The implosion method required perfectly synchronized explosive forces, something never before attempted. Even small imperfections could cause the bomb to fizzle rather than explode. Many scientists doubted it could be achieved. Choosing this path meant placing enormous faith in precision, mathematics, and human coordination under impossible conditions. Oppenheimer backed the implosion approach not out of recklessness, but necessity. New discoveries had made other designs unreliable, and the implosion method, while dangerous, offered a chance to succeed where others could not. This decision reshaped the entire project. Laboratories had to retool, calculations had to be redone, and teams had to master techniques that bordered on the impossible. Failure was no longer hypothetical. It was a daily companion. Despite the mounting tension, Oppenheimer refused to allow fear to dominate leadership. He encouraged collaboration rather than competition, understanding that secrecy alone could not sustain morale. Scientists needed to believe they were part of something larger than themselves, even if they could never speak of it openly. In private conversations, Oppenheimer acknowledged doubts but never allowed despair to take root. He understood that belief itself had become a necessary resource. As the war in Europe turned in favor of the Allies, a new and troubling question began to emerge at Los Alamos. What if Germany never completed the bomb? What if the threat that justified this project no longer existed? These thoughts were dangerous, not because they lacked logic, but because they introduced hesitation. Officially, the work continued unchanged. Unofficially, some scientists began to wrestle with whether their efforts would soon exceed their original purpose. Oppenheimer felt this conflict more deeply than most. He had devoted himself to building the bomb to prevent catastrophe, yet he could not ignore the possibility that success would create a different kind of catastrophe altogether. Still, he pressed forward. In wartime, intention mattered less than outcome, and the machinery of the project was now too large to stop. Momentum carried everything forward, toward a moment no one could yet fully imagine. By the time Germany surrendered in 1945, the bomb was nearly complete. The justification that had launched the project quietly dissolved, replaced by new strategic calculations. The focus shifted toward ending the war in the Pacific, and the bomb took on a new meaning. It was no longer a weapon of prevention, but a weapon of decision. Oppenheimer understood that his creation was about to leave the desert and enter history, and that once it did, Nothing would ever be the same again. This realization marked a silent breaking point. The work that had once felt necessary now felt inevitable. And inevitability carried its own kind of terror. Oppenheimer continued, knowing that the final test was approaching, and that soon the world would see whether humanity truly understood the power it had unlocked. As the final weeks approached, an uneasy silence settled over Los Alamos. The frantic motion that had once filled the laboratories slowly transformed into a tense stillness, the kind that arrives before something irreversible. The calculations were nearly complete. The components were coming together, and the theories that had once lived only on chalkboards were now embodied in metal, wiring, and carefully shaped explosives. What had begun as equations and fear was becoming a physical object, one that could no longer be argued away or postponed. The scientists understood that they were nearing a point where thought would give way to reality, and reality would not ask permission. Oppenheimer felt the weight of this moment more acutely than anyone else. He had carried the project from its fragile beginnings through its most uncertain failures, and now he stood at the edge of success. Yet success no longer felt like triumph. It felt heavy, final, and strangely quiet. In conversations with colleagues, he spoke less about the bomb itself and more about what would come after. He knew that history did not stop once a weapon was completed. It only accelerated. The decision to conduct a full-scale test was unavoidable. No calculation, no matter how precise, could replace a real detonation. The implosion design was too complex, too untested, and too dangerous to be trusted without proof. And so a remote location in the New Mexico desert was chosen, a place so empty that it seemed untouched by time. The test was given a name that felt almost ironic in its simplicity: Trinity. Even among those who understood its power, few could explain why such a name felt appropriate. Perhaps it reflected the strange union of science, war, and fate that had brought them there. In the days leading up to the test, tension reached a level that words could no longer capture. Some scientists made quiet jokes to mask their fear. Others withdrew completely, lost in thought. A few openly questioned whether the explosion might ignite the atmosphere or cause a chain reaction beyond control. While calculations suggested such outcomes were impossible, the fact that the question could even be asked revealed how close they were to the unknown. For the first time, humanity was preparing to release an energy that had existed only in the heart of stars. Oppenheimer moved through these final days with a strange calm. Those who observed him closely noticed that his intensity had shifted. It was no longer driven solely by urgency, but by reflection. He understood that once the test occurred, the debate would end. The world would no longer argue about whether such a weapon could exist. It would exist, and its existence alone would change the balance of power forever. On the morning of July 16, 1945, the desert waited. The device stood atop a tower, silent and unassuming, betraying nothing of what it contained. Scientists gathered at safe distances, some behind protective goggles, others turning their backs entirely. The countdown proceeded with mechanical precision, each second carrying the weight of years of work and centuries of consequence. Oppenheimer stood among them, outwardly composed, inwardly bracing for something he could not fully imagine. When the explosion came, it was not merely loud. It was overwhelming. A blinding light tore across the desert, brighter than the sun, transforming night into day in an instant. Heat followed, then a shockwave that rolled across the landscape with terrifying force. The ground trembled, and a towering cloud rose into the sky, expanding and reshaping itself as though alive. For a moment, the world seemed suspended between before and after. Silence followed, broken only by stunned reactions. Some scientists cheered. Others stood frozen. A few wept. Oppenheimer did not celebrate. In that instant, a line from ancient scripture passed through his mind. Words he had read long before the war, long before the bomb. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. It was not spoken aloud, but it echoed within him, capturing what language struggled to express. The test had succeeded, but success carried a price that could not yet be measured. The Trinity test confirmed what the project had sought to prove, but it also confirmed something far more unsettling. Humanity now possessed the means to destroy itself on a scale that had once belonged only to nature. This realization spread quietly among those who witnessed the blast. The weapon worked. The question was no longer whether it could be used, but whether it should be. News of the successful test reached political leaders quickly, and its implications were immediate. With Germany already defeated, attention turned fully toward Japan. The war in the Pacific had proven brutal, costly, and resistant to conventional solutions. Military planners viewed the bomb as a way to force an end, without a prolonged invasion. The logic was strategic, calculated, and detached from the moment in the desert where theory became fire. Oppenheimer was aware that control over the bomb had shifted. It no longer belonged to scientists. It belonged to policymakers and military command. He was consulted, but not asked to decide. His role had been to build the weapon, not to choose its use. This distinction, clear on paper, felt unbearable in reality. He had helped create something that would now be unleashed beyond his influence. As preparations moved forward, Oppenheimer's internal conflict deepened. He did not publicly oppose the bomb's use, nor did he openly advocate for it. He existed in a space of silence, burdened by understanding and constrained by circumstance. He knew that history rarely paused for moral clarity, especially in wartime. The machinery he had helped set in motion was now unstoppable. When the bomb was finally used, the world changed in an instant. News of the devastation reached Los Alamos like a distant echo, filtered through reports and numbers that could never fully convey the reality on the ground. The weapon had ended the war, but it had also opened a future filled with fear, rivalry, and the constant threat of annihilation. Oppenheimer understood this immediately. The victory was undeniable, but so was the cost. In the weeks that followed, Oppenheimer's demeanor shifted noticeably. The urgency that had once driven him gave way to introspection. He spoke openly about the need for international control of nuclear weapons and warned against an unchecked arms race. He was no longer just a scientist. He had become a witness to a transformation that could not be undone. The man chosen to build the atomic bomb had succeeded in his task, but the success had changed him forever. What remained was a question that would follow him for the rest of his life, and one that would haunt the world he had helped reshape. Now that humanity possessed such power, would it have the wisdom to live with it? In the aftermath of the bomb's use, the world moved quickly, but Oppenheimer did not. While celebrations erupted across the United States and victory filled newspaper headlines, he remained inwardly still, as though time had slowed around him. The war was over, yet the weight he carried had not lifted. The weapon he had helped create had done what it was meant to do, but it had also crossed a boundary that humanity could never uncross. Oppenheimer understood that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a far more dangerous chapter. In the months following the war, Oppenheimer became one of the most influential scientific voices in America. He was appointed chairman of the General Advisory Committee of the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission, placing him at the center of discussions about the future of nuclear weapons. Unlike many who saw the bomb as a symbol of dominance and security, Oppenheimer spoke with caution. He warned that nuclear weapons could not simply be treated as larger conventional bombs. Their existence changed the nature of war itself, turning total victory into mutual destruction. Oppenheimer believed that the power unleashed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki demanded restraint and international cooperation. He supported efforts to place nuclear technology under global oversight, hoping to prevent an uncontrolled arms race. These views, however, began to place him at odds with a rapidly changing political climate. The alliance with the Soviet Union dissolved into suspicion, and fear replaced cooperation. The Cold War emerged, and with it came a hunger for more powerful weapons, not fewer. As tensions escalated, Oppenheimer found himself increasingly isolated. His earlier political associations, once tolerated during wartime, were now viewed with deep suspicion. In an era defined by loyalty tests and ideological fear, nuance was dangerous. Oppenheimer's opposition to the development of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon far more destructive than the atomic bomb, made him enemies among those who believed absolute strength was the only path to safety. To them, caution looked like weakness. The government that had once trusted him with the most dangerous project in history now questioned his loyalty. In 1954, Oppenheimer was subjected to a highly publicized security hearing. His past was examined in exhaustive detail. Friendships and conversations dissected as evidence. The man who had once been indispensable was now treated as a liability. The hearing was less about facts than about fear, and fear had become the dominant force of the age. When the decision came, Oppenheimer lost his security clearance. Officially, it was not a conviction of disloyalty, but the effect was the same. He was removed from positions of influence. His voice silenced at the highest levels of government. For many observers, the outcome felt deeply ironic. The same nation that had relied on his judgment during its darkest hour now turned away from him when he urged restraint. Oppenheimer accepted the decision with quiet dignity. But the personal cost was immense. He retreated from public life, focusing on teaching and research, reflecting on the choices that had shaped his path. He never denied his role in building the bomb, nor did he attempt to absolve himself of responsibility. Instead, he lived with the understanding that some knowledge, once pursued, carries consequences that extend far beyond intention. History has struggled to define Oppenheimer. He is not remembered simply as a hero who helped end a war, nor as a villain who unleashed destruction. He occupies a more uncomfortable space. He represents the moment when human intelligence outran human wisdom, when the ability to create surpassed the ability to control. His life serves as a reminder that progress without reflection can lead to outcomes no one truly wants. The question of why Oppenheimer was chosen to build the atomic bomb ultimately leads beyond qualifications or timing. He was chosen because he understood the science deeply enough to make it real, and the consequences deeply enough to fear it. He was not blind to what he was creating, and that awareness shaped every decision he made. In a paradox that history rarely offers, the man best suited to build the bomb was also the man most troubled by its existence. Today, the world still lives in the shadow of the power unlocked during World War II. Nuclear weapons remain silent but present, reminders of a moment when humanity touched the edge of its own destruction. Oppenheimer's story endures not because of the bomb itself, but because of what his life reveals about choice, responsibility, and the cost of knowledge. In the end, Oppenheimer was chosen not because he sought power, but because he understood it, and in understanding it, he became a warning written into history, a reminder that the greatest dangers humanity faces are often created by its greatest achievements.